You know, there's an old proverb in the South that says if you see a turtle on a fence post, you know he didn't get there on his own. And some of you have heard that. You know, it's often been applied to men in high office, men particularly in democratic societies that are elected to high office. And oftentimes what's added to it is the phrase, and he's too dumb to know what to do now that he's there. But, you know, I think there's a deeper meaning to that phrase than politics. And I think in its original meaning, it wasn't applied to politics. If we begin to think too much about ourselves, we have to remember that we're nothing but turtles on a fence post. And the only reason we have anything at all is the grace of God. That's what put us there. And we can't earn anything on our own. In fact, any way of thought, any religion, any thought that doesn't recognize the grace of God is simply of human origin, because it all comes from God's grace. God's grace is undeserved favor in our lives. Favor he bestows on people even though they don't deserve it at all. The true religion of Jesus is a religion of undeserved favor. But you know what? The world prefers fairness. The world prefers fairness over undeserved favor. Jesus told a story to illustrate the grace that's a part of true religion. And that story is in Matthew 20. And I want you to turn there, and we're going to work through this story today. Last week we started a series called The Religion of Jesus and the Religion of Men. And we saw last week how there's a vast difference between those two. And this whole series takes place in Matthew 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, and 22. But we're really focusing on 20, 21, and 22 because there's a lot of parallel with those other chapters. But we started last week with a question that Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And they said, "You are the Christ, the Son of God." And Jesus said, "That was revealed to you by God. That's the truth of God." But then Peter stood up, and as Jesus was saying, "Now here's what's going to happen to the Son of God. He's going to Jerusalem to be killed." And Peter stood up and said, "No, wait a minute, God, that can't be true. Wait a minute, Jesus, that couldn't be." And we learned that the human mindset, apart from God's word, is a hindrance to God's kingdom. It's a hindrance to God's kingdom. It's a false religion. And what we're going to look at over the next number of weeks is stories that indicate the difference between those two things. And so today we want to look at this story in Matthew chapter 20. Again, we'll be focusing on these three chapters, 20 through 22. Jesus begins by saying the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God is like this. Now, Jesus did a whole series of sermons about the kingdom of heaven in Matthew. In fact, I looked back 14 or 15 years ago, we did a series working through a lot of those stories that Jesus told about the kingdom. But this one I wanted to look at because it's so relevant to this topic. It says, the kingdom of God is like a landowner who needed workers for his vineyard. A landowner who needed workers for his vineyard. It was harvest time. Harvest is a very busy time in that part of the world. And oftentimes they would hire extra day workers to help with the harvest. And so that's what this man was going to do. So he went to the marketplace. That's where day workers would hang out and wait to be hired. And so he went to the marketplace, and he went there early because there's a lot to do. And he found some men there willing to work, and he hired them to work. Listen to the story, Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 and 2. For the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. So he goes to the marketplace, he gathers some men that are willing to work, and notice that they agreed on a wage. They agreed on a wage. A denarius was the normal payment for a day worker for 1 day's work, and that's what they agreed to work for. And so they went out into his vineyard and they began to work. But apparently there wasn't enough help. And so the landowner did something interesting. He went back into town and gathered more workers, and he added more to that workforce. Listen to verses 3 through 7. When evening got the wrong verse. And going out about the third hour, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And he said to them, you go into the vineyard too, and whatever is right I will give you. So they went, going out again about the 6th hour, and the 9th hour he did the same. And about the 11th hour he went out and found others standing, and he said to them, why do you stand here idle all day? And they said, because no one has hired us. And so he said to them, you go into my vineyard too. And so throughout the day he kept adding workers. To put it in our language, he went out at 6 o'clock in the morning because harvest was near equinox, so sunrise to sunset was roughly 6 to 6. And so he went to the marketplace at 6 in the morning at sunrise and gathered the first workers. He went back at 9 and found some more. He went back at noon and found a few others. He went back at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and found some more. And finally, he went back at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. There's still some guys standing around that needed work, and so he asked them to come and work the last hour of the day as well. And then it was time to pay them. Now, Jewish law required day workers to be paid that day. You couldn't withhold pay for a day or two or a week or two or whatever. You had to pay them at the end of the day. That was Jewish law. And so he gathered these men to pay them, and they were all paid the same thing. They were all paid the same thing. Listen to this part of the story. When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last up to the first. And when those hired about the 11th hour came, each of them received a denarius. They all received the same pay. Now, I want you to put yourself in that situation and imagine that you'd been working 9 or 12 hours. And you're lining up, you're at the back of the line to get your pay. And what you see is the people at the front of the line who worked for an hour or 4 hours getting paid, same thing that you thought you were going to get paid. Now, what's going through your mind? More than likely, if you're like anybody else, you're thinking, oh, he's paying them extra. He's going to pay us even more than that. We're going to get more. And they were none too happy when they got to the front of the line and they got paid 1 denarius. They were not very happy about that. And so what followed was this discussion where the workers who were hired first grumbled. And they seem to have a good cause. Listen to what they say. Verse 11. Verse 10. Now when those hired first came, they thought they would receive more. But each of them also received a denarius. And on receiving it, they grumbled at the master of the house, saying, the last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat. It seems like maybe they have a good case. They're saying, wait a minute, this isn't fair. You're paying them for an hour's worth of work, the same thing that you're paying us for 12 hours worth of work. It seems in fairness that whoever works the longest should get paid the most. I think all of you would agree with that. That's what's fair. That whoever works the longest gets paid the most, but that's not what happened. You see, these men had raised their expectations. As they stood in line, they raised their expectations. And by the way, a lot of times grumbling comes from raised expectations more than anything else. Unreal expectations in some cases. And so they didn't get what they wanted, and they began to grumble. But you know what the owner did? He pointed out, you're getting exactly what you agreed to. He told them, you're getting exactly what you agreed to work for. Listen to verse 13 to the end of the story. But he replied to one of them, friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree to work for me for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last worker as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity? So the last will be first and the first last. They come and they grumble, and the man says, I'm being fair to you. You agreed to work for that price, but I choose to give. Notice he doesn't say pay. He says, I choose to give to the last ones hired, the same thing that I'm giving to you. You see, the issue of this story, the issue of this landowner is not fairness. It's generosity. That's the real issue. It's generosity. he was perfectly fair to the first workers. Now, there are some people who have argued that this story presents a case for socialism as an economic base. I would say it doesn't. It's very clear that this man was free to do with his money what he wanted to do. And socialism isn't a freedom, it's a forced sharing of everything. However, he chose to be generous. By the way, this story might show what runs in the minds of workers in socialism. Because in a system where everybody gets almost the same thing, those who work the hardest eventually start grumbling about it. And everybody works less and less until the economy slows down and stops. So that's not what this is advocating here. But those of us who don't like socialism sometimes ignore what it is advocating, and that is generosity. Because that's the point of the story. The whole story is about generosity and the generosity of this landowner to give these men who wouldn't be able to feed their families otherwise a full day's wage for a part day's work. That's what the story is all about. It's a pretty simple story. It's one I've liked for years I don't even know why. It's just a fascinating story to me. And Jesus has some of the most creative stories. But it has some points of relevance for us that I want to consider today. Here's the first one. I've already said it. The emphasis of the story is the owner's generosity. The emphasis of the story is the owner's generosity. Verse 9 is a big surprise. You know, sometimes in Jesus' parables, the big surprise points to what the real meaning is. I mean, think about a camel and a needle. Think about a Samaritan that was actually the good guy. Think about a dishonest manager who was wasting money and yet was commended for it. Think about the tax collector, for instance, that went to the temple and God heard his prayer. And you could go through more, but oftentimes the big surprise is the whole point of the story. Here's the big surprise in this story. Verse 9, when those hired at the 11th hour came, each of them received a denarius. Everything's normal in this story till that point, and suddenly, whoa, something's wrong here. These guys got paid way more than they deserved. And that's when the story changes, and that's the big surprise. That's the whole point of the story. The discussion that follows only emphasizes that that's the whole point, is the generosity of the owner. This is not a lesson in how to pay your employees, okay? Those in socialism and communism and liberation theology will tell you that's what this is about, a lesson in how to pay your employees. But that ignores the main point. And the main point of the story is undeserved favor. That's the point of the story. It's undeserved, and yet this owner gives it anyway. The religion of Jesus is all about undeserved favor. That's what we call grace. It's not about fairness. It's about undeserved favor. This is a story of abundant grace. The religion of Jesus is all about grace. Abundant grace. It's the only way we can join the religion of Jesus. It's by faith in his grace. None of us have worked perfectly enough to earn it. No matter how good we think we are, none of us have worked perfectly to earn it. It's all about his grace. The emphasis is on the owner's generosity. Second point of relevance. God can deal out his mercy as he sees fit. God can deal out his mercy as he sees fit. He owns it all. I mean, he's the landowner. He's the king. He's the one who can deal as he sees fit. It's his kingdom. It's his religion. Fortunately, he does it with generosity. He does it with generosity, with abundant grace. In this story, again, the owner clearly says, it's mine to do with what I choose, and I choose to be generous. By the way, if you feel like you're being drawn to God in anything, that is a part of God's grace working in your life. Because Jesus said, no one can come to the Father, no one can come to me unless the Father draws him. And no one can come to the Father unless he comes through me. And so if you're feeling drawn to God, that is a part of God's grace working in your life. You must respond to that in faith by trusting that he is a good God. You follow Jesus rather than following the ideas of human religion. And that is grace. You know, if God were really fair, we'd all be condemned. Because none of us is perfect and God is. And our imperfections fall way short. So if God was really fair, all of us would be condemned. But God deals out his mercy with generosity. And that indicates, number 3, that God is compassionate. And he seeks the lost. Did you notice how this landowner went out looking for the unemployed? He kept going back to the marketplace. I kind of laughed at Cariana Wednesday. How come he keeps going back to the marketplace? Doesn't he have anything to do at home? And it occurred to me that he's looking for people to be generous to. He's looking for those people that won't have an income for their family unless they come and work. He's out looking for them. There's a compassion in seeking those kinds of people. Jesus told 3 stories in Luke chapter 15. They're all famous stories, but you can look them up and read them. One is about a lost coin. One is about a lost sheep. And the most famous one of all is about a lost son. And in that last story, that father's always looking for that son to come home. In the other 2, the owners of that sheep and that coin go out and make a diligent search to try to find the one that is lost. The good shepherd leaves the 99 to seek the one that is lost. That's the kind of compassion that our God has in seeking the lost. In Luke 19:10, a couple chapters later, Jesus specifically said, I came to seek and to save the lost. That's why he came, to seek and to save lost people. He is compassionate and he seeks out the lost. You know, we should try to copy that compassion in our own lives. Always seeking for those who are lost and who need God's grace. And that brings up another point, by the way. There's a similar story. I told you I'd refer back to a number of these other stories. There's a similar story in Matthew chapter 18 that begins in verse 21 that I think illustrates this part of this message. Because Peter said to Jesus, how often should I forgive my brother? Should I forgive him 7 times? You know what that is? That's human thinking. How often do I forgive? If you forgive, you don't keep a record. So you wouldn't be counting at all. Jesus says, no, you just keep forgiving and forgiving. You just continue to forgive. That's what the religion of Jesus is about. It's about grace, not fairness. Because Peter was thinking fairness. 7 times, that's fair enough. No, Jesus said, just continue to forgive and to forgive. Just this week, I read these verses in my own quiet time. I just thought how appropriate this was. Luke 6, beginning in verse 32. If you love those who love you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. That's fair, isn't it? And if you do good to those who do good to you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. That's fair. And if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to get back the same amount. That's fair, isn't it? But love your enemies. Do good, lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High God. For he is kind to the ungrateful and to the evil. Be merciful, even as your Father is merciful. I was reading along, and that phrase, he is kind to the ungrateful and the evil, just kind of jumped out at me this week. He is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. That's pretty much all of us. You see, it's a religion of grace, not of fairness. Finally, number 5, and this has a whole bunch of subpoints. In the true religion of Jesus, no one is better than anyone else. No one is better than another in the true religion of Jesus. And this is something the church today needs to hear. All are recipients of grace and not fairness. You know, all these workers got paid the same. All of us who are in God's kingdom get the same grace. It's not fairness, it's grace. No one can work enough to earn it. No one has enough resources to pay for it. We simply cannot do that. It can only be received as a gift. That's what grace is all about. I love Psalm 49. In fact, we've used it a couple different times in this church on Communion Sundays, where it says, "Truly no one can ransom the life of another or give to God the cost of his life. For the ransom of a life is costly and can never suffice that he should live on forever and never see the pit." No one can pay a ransom for a life. But he goes on to say near the end of that psalm, "But God will ransom my life." You see, it's God who pays the ransom for our life, and he did that through his son Jesus Christ in his sacrifice, because we deserve death for our sin, but Jesus took that death on himself. God paid the sacrifice. So we're all recipients of grace. That has a lot of implications for today. For instance, it means no boasting. No boasting. No one can say, "I did more." No one can say, "I worked harder." No one can say, "I earned it." No one can say, "I get more jewels in my crown." By the way, that is an unbiblical picture. I know there used to be a hymn about jewels in my crown or stars in my crown or something. That's not a biblical concept at all. You see, there's two words in the New Testament for crown. One is a diadem. It's a crown that only royalty wears. And that crown, the diadem, that word is only used when it's talking about God and when it's talking about kings. The diadem. It's never applied to the saints. There's a second word for crown called a Stephanos. You know what that was? That's the victor's crown. Remember the laurel wreaths they would put on the heads of the winners in the Olympics? If you watched the Olympics in Athens a number of years, I think it was 2000, that's 20 years ago, all of the people up on the medal stand had these laurel wreaths. That's the Stephanos. That's the victor's crown. That's the crown that's promised to the saints. It's not a crown with jewels in it. And that just goes against the whole idea of God's grace and plays into the idea of works. No, that's the wrong idea. No one gets more jewels. No one can say, "I worked hard enough to get it." Isaiah 10:15. Can the axe raise itself against him who swings it, or the saw boast against him who uses it? Can you imagine a carpenter's tool standing up and saying, "Look what I built"? It doesn't happen, because it's the carpenter who builds it. Those are just tools. And that's exactly what Isaiah is saying. Can the axe raise itself above him who swings it, or the saw boast against him who uses it? You know what it sounds like? A turtle on a fence post. That's what it sounds like, doesn't it? There's no boasting. Second subpoint, all receive the same welcome into God's kingdom. You know, in our eyes, some seem more deserving than others. Some seem more deserving than others. The angels were not waiting more expectantly for Ravi Zacharias or R.C. Sproul than they're waiting for you or for me. Some great saints that passed away this year. They weren't waiting any more expectantly for them than they are for you. In fact, if those men have accomplished anything of significant value in their lives, it was done by the grace of God. If I've accomplished anything of significance in my life, it's all the grace of God. And if you have accomplished anything at all that's eternal significance, it's the grace of God. It's not your own working. And so we all receive the same welcome. By the way, sometimes when Billy Graham was questioned about his ministry and the success of his ministry, you know what he said? If you put a turtle on a fence post, you know it didn't get there by itself. That was his honest answer sometimes. He was from North Carolina, you get it. So, you know, there's no boasting. All receive the same welcome, and no one can claim special. Oh, let me go back to that same welcome. There's one other thing I want to say about that. John 3 has an interesting section in it. You know John 3:16. It's a popular verse that everybody knows. A few verses later, the chapter says this. This is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but men loved the darkness more than the light because their deeds were evil. Men doing evil deeds don't come to the light. They're afraid of the light because it reveals their evil deeds. But those who practice the truth come to the light so that it reveals that their deeds were accomplished by God. You know what I think when I think of God's judgment at the end of time? I think evil people stand up and what's shown is their evil deeds. But those who trust in Jesus Christ stand up and what's shown is the righteousness of Christ and the works that God did through them. That's what's shown when they come into the light. There's no condemnation for those in Christ Jesus. Rather, God's grace is seen visible, and he gets all the praise and all the glory. That ought to be an encouraging note to you, because some people have this idea that all my deeds are going to be revealed. That verse would indicate maybe not. That instead what's revealed is what God has done in our lives. Next point. No one can claim special honors in God's kingdom. Long-term members of the church don't get the right to control it. If you're here as a long-term member, you're here by God's grace and nothing else. And you know what? Those in positions of authority in the church can't look down on others. If they're there, it's simply because of God's grace. In fact, if you're one of the leaders in this church, you should be amazed that you're in that position rather than looking down at others for being there. Sometimes, it's that turtle story again. I feel that way sometimes. I come in here on Sunday morning before anybody's here and kind of walk and pray around the room. And there are times I walk up to this stage and I'm just overwhelmed that I can even step up here because I know I don't deserve it. I know I'm not. I don't like the title reverend because you know what that means? You're holier than everybody else. And I'm not. I'm just another sinner. But it's by God's grace that all of these things can happen. And those who have been believers for a long time cannot resent new believers. Sometimes we have our club rules in church and people come in who don't act like us or look like us and we kind of look down our nose on them. But you know what? We should rejoice when people come because they're coming because of God's grace if they've come to Jesus. In fact, Jesus' closing comment, I think should give pause to us that have been believers for a long time. So the last will be first and the first will be last. That should give pause to those of us who have been believers for a long time, shouldn't it? Because sometimes we kind of think in our minds that we deserve a little more. This has been a hard lesson for me. I grew up in the church. I trusted Jesus as my Savior at an early age. I didn't have a rebellious teenage time. I mean, I was just a good kid, to be honest. But good is not good enough. And sometimes I have this attitude that I deserve God's grace. But it wouldn't be grace if I did. It's only grace because it's undeserved favor. And I have to realize the depth of my own sin. And if I had fairness instead of undeserved favor, I would be condemned just as everybody else would be. The religion of Jesus is all about grace. It's all about undeserved favor, not fairness. In a minute, we're going to sing this song as a closing. Make it your closing prayer, your closing worship. It's been one of the most popular praise songs over the last 3 or 4 years. But I actually almost quoted from it twice during this message. He leaves the 99 to seek the one. And there's no way I could earn it. There's no way I deserve it. It's the amazing and reckless love of God.